Welcome to the Gospel Doctrine Helps class, where we provide you with insights, quotes, references, and help for your Gospel Doctrine class.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Doctrine Helps class, where we look to help you in teaching your Gospel Doctrine class. And today we are on the New Testament Come Follow Me manual, and specifically we are looking at the lesson on Hebrews chapter 7 through chapter 13. And the title of this lesson is An High Priest of Good Things to Come. I'm going to spare you reading through those subsection headlines. And the first section is literally Hebrews 7 verses 1 through 22. I've mentioned this pretty much every time I've given a video, which is if you just spent your time reading the scriptures, that's all the information you need. But we want to dig deeper. We want to have further light. We want to have additional knowledge. We want to understand what the scriptures are telling us. And so we need to focus. We need to concentrate. We need to dig deep and find additional light and truth. And what I'm going to focus on today is essentially just Hebrews verse 3 of chapter 7. I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. Now, I don't think I did this in the last episode, giving you a brief just history of Hebrews, how we got it, who wrote it. Most gospel scholars will tell you that Paul wrote the Hebrews. Now, what does Hebrew mean? Well, it means Jewish Christians. That's who it was written to, those who had converted to Christianity from Judaism, those who were of Hebrew descent. But it also, there are scholars who believe that it was Luke or Barnabas or Apollos who wrote this letter to the Hebrews. But traditionally it's attributed to Paul. This was written in about 70 AD. And if you've already read through verses or chapters 1 through 6, you'll see that at the end of 6, specifically in verses 15 through 20, they're really starting to talk about priesthood. They're talking about Melchizedek. And so as we pick it up in verses 1 through 3 of Hebrews 7, you'll see that we're talking about not just Melchizedek the person, who was Shem, whose new name was Melchizedek, which means king and priest, but we're also talking about priesthood, and we're going to talk about that today. That's going to be the topic of what we cover today. So I'm going to read Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 through 3, and then we'll talk about it. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. So what is it? I'm going to stop right here, verse 1, and ask the question. You can ask this to your class. What is it that those who hold the priesthood do? What is their obligation? What is their duty? What is it that they do? And here, I think you can take just from this verse alone, and you see that he blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. What does it mean to bless another person? How is it that we bless each other? Think about that, and you could have a discussion in your class about it or in your family. Verse 2, Hebrews chapter 7, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. So here we have that Abraham paid a tenth part of all, or we would call that a tithing in today's vernacular, to Melchizedek, and it gives him three names. It says that his name was King of Righteousness, King of Salem, or King of Peace, all being or meaning the same. I do have some notes here that we should look at. Alma 13, 2 through 5, and Joseph Smith History, chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, as well as verse 62. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. We'll look at those verses. And then finally, verse 3, without father, without mother, without descendant, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. This is the scripture, the verse I want to focus on in this lesson. I think it's a good idea that we dig deep into this, try and understand, what is he talking about? What does it mean without father and without mother? Does this mean that Abraham or Melchizedek didn't have parents? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It says without descendant. Does that mean they didn't have children? Of course not. It doesn't mean that. I mean, Abraham was blessed that his posterity would be as numerous as the sands of the sea. We have evidence that this is not the case. It says nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God. So what he's talking about here is priesthood, is an oath, is a covenant between the person, the man, and God. So let's talk about this. Let's look at next. Go to the back of your Bible and go to the Joseph Smith translation, and let's look specifically at Joseph Smith, Genesis chapter 14, and let's look and read just 26 through 28. And 28's the key verse. If you are short on time, you just want to hit 28, that's fine. I'm going to read 26 through 28. This says, Now Melchizedek was a man of faith, who wrought righteousness. And when a child, he feared God, and stopped the mouths of lions, and quenched the violence of fire. And thus, having been approved of God, he was ordained an high priest after the order of the covenant which God made with Enoch. This is verse 28. It being after the order of the Son of God, which order came not by man, nor the will of man, neither by father nor mother, neither by beginning of days nor end of years, but of God. You see, what he's talking about here is that Melchizedek received something directly from God. It didn't come from his mom, didn't come from his dad. It was without beginning of days or end of years. What does that mean? What is without beginning of days and end of years? That is the word eternity. That is outside of time and space. Remember, with God, everything is as one day with God. That's, gosh, I'm going to have to look it up quick. I think it's Alma 40. Oh, I don't know if I can remember the verse, but let's see if I can find it quick. If you've got your scriptures, you might be able to beat me to it. Turn to Alma 40. And let's see here. Is it verse 30? No, there is no verse 30. Let's see if I can't find it here. Here it is. It's Alma 40, verse 8. It starts on page 307 of my version. It says, All is as one day with God, and time only is measured unto men. So what does that mean? That means that everything that is done with God is outside of time and space. It is on the other side of the veil. And so when you read here in Genesis 14:28, and it talks about the order that came not by man, nor the will of man, neither by father nor mother, neither by beginning of days nor end of years, but of God, this is something that happens in eternity. And as we're going to look through here shortly, there is something that if you acquire this outside of time and space, you get to carry it with you. Because you've qualified for it. So a great recent example of this is found in, and I mentioned this earlier, it's found in Joseph Smith history. So if you want to grab your Pearl of Great Price and open up to that, and let's just look at verses 16 through 20. And what you're going to read here is we read 16 through 20, and I'm not going to read it all, but if you read it all, it talks about how Joseph he read in James 1:5, if you lack wisdom, ask God. He goes, he asks God in verse 17. Two personages appear to him. One of them called him by name, pointing to the other, said, This is my beloved son, hear him. And he has this discussion with God. And if you read verses 16 through 20 there, what you realize is that Joseph Smith, when he was 14 years old, had an encounter with God. So if that's true, and the scriptures are true, then we ought to all go back to Doctrine and Covenants, section 84. And this is commonly referred to as the section that talks about the oath and the covenant of the priesthood. But it mentions something here in verses 19. Let's see here. It says, And this greater priesthood administereth the gospel and holdeth the key of the mysteries of the kingdom of God, even the key of knowledge of God. In other words, in order to have knowledge of God, you need to have priesthood, or at least this priesthood administers the key of the knowledge of God. Verse 20, Therefore in the ordinances thereof the power of godliness is manifest. And without the ordinances thereof and the authority of the priesthood, the power of godliness is not manifest unto men in the flesh. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. That's verse 22 of section 84. Now, since that's the case, that means that you must have Melchizedek priesthood to see the face of God and live. That means that at this moment, when Joseph Smith entered into a grove of trees and prayed and saw God the Father in the flesh and lived, that he had Melchizedek priesthood. Otherwise, he couldn't have done so because the scriptures are true. We can have faith and trust in them. So when you're reading that and you're thinking about that, you say to yourself, how is that possible? No one showed up to lay their hands on Joseph Smith's head until afterwards, and that was John the Baptist. That's the first record we have of any priesthood being confirmed. And that was, after baptism, that was 1829. And we're reading here in 1820, that was 9 years later. So how is that possible? It's possible because all of us lived with God before we came down to this earth. And all of us qualified for those things that we receive while we are here in the premortal life. Now, while we are here, it doesn't matter so much what happened before. I mean, it does matter, but there's nothing we can do to change it. So it doesn't matter who or what we did before. What matters is what we do here and what we do now and what we qualify for going forward. And so I wanted to bring to your attention that when it says it's in Hebrews 7, verse 3, without father, without mother, without descendant, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, what we're talking about here is something that continues on after this life. If you qualify and receive Melchizedek priesthood in eternity from God, you will qualify to carry that with you into the next life. And what do you do when you have this priesthood? Well, you bless others, right? That's what Melchizedek did for Abraham. Let's go back to Joseph Smith translation of Genesis 14. I'm going to turn there quickly. And it's important that we get some more enlightenment and some more understanding about what it is that you can do when you have this power of God, right? Verse 29 of Genesis 14. And it was delivered unto men by the calling of his own voice, according to his own will, unto as many as believed on his name. Well, why is that important? Why is it important that we talk about the calling of his own voice? Because this is something between God and man. This is not something between you and another man. So let me go back to D&C 84. I know we're flipping around in the scriptures a lot, but it's okay. And you ought to take this stuff and just study it out on your own for a while. Let's see here. Back to 84. This is verse 19. And this greater priesthood administereth the gospel and holdeth the key of the mysteries of the kingdom, even the key of the knowledge of God. So ask yourself, what are the mysteries of the kingdom? What is the key of the knowledge of God? I think we've got some more studying to do. As you look at this, make sure you look up John 17:3 when it talks about the knowledge of God. In the ordinances thereof, the power of godliness is manifest, and without the ordinances thereof and the authority of the priesthood, the power of God is not manifest unto men in the flesh. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. Now this Moses plainly taught unto the children of Israel in the wilderness, and sought diligently to sanctify his people, that they might behold the face of God. But they hardened their hearts, and could not endure his presence. What is the qualifier there that allows you to see the face of God and live? It's by having a soft heart. It's doing the opposite of what the children of Israel did. They had hard hearts. Don't you have a hard heart? And we've talked about this before. It's Alma 12. I bring this up probably every lesson because it's so profound. And it's 12 verses 9 through 10. It is given unto many to know the mysteries of God. Nevertheless, they are laid under a strict command, that they shall not impart only according to the portion of his word, which he doth grant unto the children of men, according to the heed and diligence which they give unto him. Give heed and diligence to Christ. Therefore he that will harden his heart, the same receiveth the lesser portion of the word, And he that will not harden his heart, to him is given the greater portion of the word, until it is given unto him to know the mysteries of God, until he know them in full. If you want to know the mysteries of God, if you want to know them in full, have a soft heart. Be willing to learn. There's a passage here in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 168, that gives us some additional insight into this. Oh, let's see here. We've talked about this before, but this is 168. God will not acknowledge that which he has not called, ordained, and chosen. Think about that for a minute. We're talking about the priesthood being connected directly with God, done in eternity on the other side of the veil. And here we have, God will not acknowledge that which he has not called, ordained, and chosen. So if someone else calls, ordains, and chooses someone to receive priesthood, it might not be of God, because God will only vouch for those things that he has taken responsibility for. Let's keep reading. There's some interesting passages in Alma 13 that relate to priesthood. And I would suggest that when you have time, read this entire chapter 13. It will give you a lot of information. But if you look at just verse 3, this is the manner after which they were ordained, being called and prepared from the foundation of the world. This gives you the idea that this happened before we came here, from the foundation of the world, according to the foreknowledge of God. How is it that God has foreknowledge? How is it that he knows you and knows how you will act while you are here on this earth? On account of their exceeding faith and good works, and in the first place being left to choose good or evil, therefore they, having chosen good and exercising exceedingly great faith, are called with a holy calling, yea, with that holy calling which was prepared with and according to a preparatory redemption for such. And thus they have been called to this holy calling on account of their faith. How are you called to receive priesthood? How are you called to receive authority from God? How are you called to receive power from God? It is according to God's foreknowledge of you. What is it that you did before? What is it that you're doing now? How can you qualify now if you didn't qualify before? You can qualify through your faith, through your heed, through your diligence unto him. You need to connect with God. You need to get this directly from him. We've read it in section 84 before. I'm going back to it. Well, when I say before, not in this lesson, but in other lessons. This is verse 42 of section 84. And woe unto all those who come not unto this priesthood, which ye have received, which I now confirm upon you who are present this day by mine own voice out of the heavens. Did you catch that? Those who were present when this revelation was received, they received priesthood by mine own voice out of the heavens. You see, God confers priesthood. We often look at this and we say, oh, it's Leviticus, right? Let me find the verse here. Let's look at verse 32 of Leviticus 16. And the priest whom he shall anoint, and whom he shall consecrate to minister in the priest's office in his father's stead, shall make the atonement and shall put on the linen clothes, even the holy garments. You see, the priest is the one whom he shall anoint and consecrate. So we have this idea that if someone, we like to point to the time and date, right, where hands were laid on someone's head and priesthood was conferred. That's just the start. That's just the beginning. It needs to come to a point where God and man connect, where there is an association with God and man. Because without that connection, well, you can read it in Doctrine and Covenants section 121. If you aren't connected, then amen to your priesthood. You don't have any. And so the next thing we need to look at is found in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 180. And then we'll talk briefly about why we bring this up and why it's important. Because you and your faith matter. Whether you're a man or a woman, your faith matter. This is Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 180. At the bottom it says, all priesthood is Melchizedek, but there are different degrees or portions of it. That portion which brought Moses to speak with God face to face was taken away, but that which brought the ministry of angels remained. All the prophets had the Melchizedek priesthood and were ordained by God himself. Some additional verses you may want to look at related to this would be found on Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 51, 348, Doctrine and Covenants 84, and 33. But the point I want to bring out to you is that here Moses, that power, that priesthood that brought Moses into the presence of God was taken away, but what remained? The priesthood that gave you the ministering of angels, which is what we call Aaronic, or the Levitical priesthood. Why is priesthood important? Priesthood is important because when someone has priesthood, they can bless the lives of others. How do they bless the lives of others? Well, it's not just giving service, because we can all give service. It's because in the ordinances of the priesthood, the power of godliness is manifest. That power of godliness brings you closer to God because it gives you hope. And it increases your faith that the ordinances, for example, of baptism, that you, like being buried in the water, will be resurrected after this life. It gives you hope. It increases your faith, and it connects you to God in a very real way. Think of the sacrament when you partake of the bread and the water. These things are small, but when you partake of them, it is as if you are connected to Christ because you are partaking of the atonement. Drinking the water is a symbol of his blood that was shed for you. Taking the bread is a symbol of his body that was broken for you. You see, all of these ordinances connect us to Christ. And if you don't see in those ordinances your connection to God, then you've missed the point of the ordinances. And there are other ordinances. And the whole idea and point behind priesthood is to give you hope so that you can, in faith, act according to the will of God, which is to keep the commandments. It all comes down to keeping the commandments. Why is that? Because without an effort to fight against the things of this world and to connect to the things of God, we miss the point. We don't connect to heaven. So how is it if someone has priesthood that you can tell if someone has priesthood? Well, it starts with what you're able to do with priesthood. And what are you able to do? Well, it goes back to what we were looking at earlier in Genesis 14, Joseph Smith, Genesis 14, because it says what's the result of this, right? Well, what can you do by faith? This picking up in verse 30 of Joseph Smith, Genesis 14, for God having sworn an oath unto Enoch and unto his seed with an oath by himself, that everyone being ordained after this order and calling should have power by faith to break mountains, to divide the seas, to dry up waters, to turn them out of their course, to put at defiance the armies of nations, to divide the earth, to break every band, to stand in the presence of God, to do all things according to his will, according to his command, subdue principalities and powers, and by this, by the will of the Son of God, which was from before the foundation of the world. And I'm just going to stop there in verse 31 for a moment, and I want to bring a few things to your attention. First of all, it outlines all this power, what you can do. You can divide the seas, break mountains, dry up waters, make them turn out of their course. I mean, these things are what we would call miraculous demonstrations of power. Does that mean that someone who has this power will just automatically go out and use it? No, and let me tell you why. Because it says to do all things according to his will, his being God's will. If it is not according to God's will, then it won't happen. I will give you a couple examples. I'll give you one example. If you read in 1 Nephi, and you'll have to look up these verses. I don't have them at the top of my head. I could probably look them up quick. One is 1 Nephi chapter 7, verses 16 through 18. That's the first one. And what you'll see there is Nephi's brothers. They bind him up, and with the power of God, he breaks those bands. Yet later, when they're on the ship coming to the Americas, they bind him up, and he didn't have power to break the bands. Why is that? Because it wasn't according to God's will. You see, everything has to be according to God's will. If it's not according to God's will, then it doesn't happen. Moses divided the seas. We know Moses had this power. Look at Exodus 14:21. Enoch turned waters out of their course. Look at Moses chapter 7, verse 13. Elisha, he held at defiance the armies of Syria. Look at 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 14 through 23. Joseph Smith stood in the presence of God. D&C 76, verse 20. So did Sidney Rigdon. They had power in the priesthood. That's how you know that they had this type of priesthood. What is this priesthood good for? It is good for blessing others. It is good for pointing others to Christ. That is the role of a true messenger. A true messenger won't point to themselves and say, look at me, I'm so great and wonderful, yada, yada, yada. No. They don't do that at all. Instead, they point to Christ. They have you worship Christ. They have you follow Christ. And they say, you know what? I'm not going to give you power because power only comes from God. I can point you in the right direction, but I can't not give you what he offers. What he offers is freely given, but you need to come unto him. How do you come unto Christ? Well, you do it by keeping the commandments. You do it by praying, and you sincerely say, Lord, I want to know you. Teach me how to come unto you. I'm trying. I'm keeping this commandment. I'm keeping this one I struggle with. Help me overcome this sin, this bad behavior. Forgive me of my sins. You pray, you connect, you have a conversation with. It's a two-way street. It's not just you saying, gosh, I've got these things on my shopping list. I'd like this and this and this. Please give me this and this. It's not like that at all. It's you being a humble, meek, submissive servant looking to do God's will because you love him, because he loves you. And love is the power of God. How else can God bless others unless he loves them? He loves them. He loves you because you are his child. Priesthood isn't to control, exercise dominion, authority over others, and it's not to subdue them. It is to invite them, persuade them to keep the commandments of God and to connect God and get revelation for yourself. The more you study the gospel, the more you realize that God not only loves you, but he loves everybody. And he intends to save all of us. And he can because of what he did. I hope you found the information in this lesson helpful. Thanks for watching.